The children drove their frail, aging father out into the cold, believing he had nothing left to offer. They never knew he had hidden away $8 million, money earned through decades of hardship and love for the very family that abandoned him. Their cruelty would soon cost them everything. The morning sun filtered through the wide windows of the green house on Maple Street, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors that Jonathan Harris had installed with his own hands 43 years ago. He stood at the kitchen counter, methodically measuring coffee grounds, his movements deliberate and practiced. At 78, his hands still possessed the steadiness of a craftsman, though they now bore the age spots and fine tremor that whispered of time's passage. Jonathan had built this house when Michael was just a toddler and Emily a gleam in Margaret's eye. Every beam, every joint, every carefully placed stone in the foundation held memories. The green paint that gave the house its nickname had been Margaret's choice, a soft sage that she said reminded her of the meadows behind her childhood home. He'd repainted it 3 times since her death, each coat an act of devotion to her memory. The familiar sounds of conflict drifted from the living room, where Michael's voice carried the sharp edge of frustration. Phone calls from creditors had become a morning ritual, each conversation chipping away at his son's composure. Jonathan listened to the strained apologies, the promises of payment that both parties knew were fragile, and felt the weight of helplessness settle on his shoulders like an old coat. Emily emerged from the bathroom, her eyes puffy from another sleepless night. She moved through the house like a ghost of her former self, the vibrant woman who had once commanded her own salon, reduced to someone who jumped at unexpected sounds. Her divorce papers lay scattered on the dining room table, each page a reminder of another dream that had crumbled. "Good morning, sweetheart," Jonathan offered gently, extending a cup of coffee prepared exactly as she liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream. Emily accepted it with a wan smile that never quite reached her eyes. These small gestures, once appreciated, now seemed to irritate her. He could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the barely perceptible sigh that escaped her lips. The house felt smaller with his adult children occupying it again. Not physically. There was plenty of space in the 4-bedroom home. But emotionally, the walls seemed to absorb their tension, their unspoken resentments, their private fears. Jonathan found himself walking more carefully, speaking more softly, as if his very presence might disturb the delicate balance of their shared misery. In the den, surrounded by photographs spanning decades, Jonathan kept his most treasured possessions. The pocket watch that had belonged to his father sat in a place of honor on the mantel, its face catching the light at certain angles. Beside it, a small metal box that Margaret had given him for their first wedding anniversary, engraved with words that still made his heart ache. "What is kept with love is never lost." Inside the box, he kept ticket stubs from their first movie date, dried flowers from their wedding bouquet, and a small iron key that Margaret had found at an antique shop, claiming it looked like it belonged to a treasure chest. The key had become something of a private joke between them. Margaret would hand it to him during difficult times, claiming it was the key to happiness, to peace, to whatever they needed most in that moment. After her death, he'd carried it in his pocket as a talisman, a tangible connection to the woman who had been his anchor for 47 years. Michael's voice crescendoed in the living room, followed by the sharp crack of a phone being slammed down. Jonathan winced, remembering when that same voice had called him Dad with joy instead of obligation. His son had been laid off 8 months ago, and each rejection letter seemed to carve deeper lines into Michael's face. Pride had always been Michael's weakness, the same pride that now prevented him from accepting his father's offers of help. The morning routine continued in strained silence. Emily picked at her breakfast while scrolling through job listings on her phone. Michael paced the living room like a caged animal, his frustration radiating outward in waves. And Jonathan, the man who had once been the foundation of this family, now felt like an intruder in his own home. He retreated to his workshop in the basement, where the scent of wood shavings and old tools provided comfort. Here, surrounded by the implements of creation, he could almost imagine Margaret's laughter echoing from upstairs, could almost believe that the discord above would resolve itself if he just gave it time. But time, Jonathan was beginning to understand, was not always the healer people claimed it to be. The second week of autumn brought a chill that seemed to seep through the greenhouse's walls, settling into the bones of its inhabitants. Jonathan noticed how his children had begun to avoid the common areas when he was present, timing their movements to minimize contact. Emily would wait until she heard his footsteps on the stairs before venturing into the kitchen. Michael spent most of his time in the guest bedroom, emerging only for meals that grew increasingly silent. Jonathan tried to bridge the growing distance with stories. During dinner, when they all managed to sit at the same table, he would recount tales of their childhood, hoping to spark recognition of the family they had once been. He told Emily about the time she had insisted on painting her bedroom walls with watercolors, creating a muddy rainbow that Margaret had declared abstract art. He reminded Michael of the treehouse they had built together, how his son had wanted to install electricity so he could read comic books after dark. But his stories met blank stares and polite smiles that felt more like grimaces. Emily would nod absently while checking her phone for potential job opportunities that never materialized. Michael would grunt acknowledgement before excusing himself to make more calls, each one a futile attempt to resurrect his career from the ashes of corporate downsizing. The tension crystallized one evening when Jonathan found Emily sitting on the stairs, her head in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and for a moment, he was transported back 30 years to when she was 6 and had fallen from her bicycle. Then she had run to him for comfort, trusted him to kiss away the hurt. Now, when he approached, she stiffened and wiped her eyes quickly. "I'm fine, Dad," she lied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Just tired." But Jonathan could see the depth of her pain, the way defeat had settled into her posture. Her salon had been her pride, a place where she had created beauty and community. The pandemic had stolen both from her, and her marriage had collapsed under the weight of financial strain and forced proximity. She was drowning in debt and heartbreak, and somehow his attempts to comfort her only seemed to push her deeper underwater. Michael's crisis manifested differently, but no less painfully. Jonathan would hear him late at night, pacing in the guest room, muttering phone numbers and rehearsing pitches that would never be heard. The bathroom had become his refuge, the only place where he allowed himself to break down. Jonathan had heard the muffled sounds through the thin walls, harsh breathing, stifled sobs, the sound of a man trying to hold himself together with willpower alone. During one particularly difficult morning, Jonathan attempted to offer practical help. He had savings, investments that Margaret had insisted they maintain for the children's future. But when he broached the subject over breakfast, Michael's reaction was explosive. "I don't need your charity," Michael snapped, his coffee cup hitting the table harder than necessary. "I'm not a child anymore, Dad. I can handle my own problems." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Jonathan absorbed them quietly, recognizing his own stubborn pride reflected in his son's rejection. He had raised Michael to be independent, to solve his own problems, and now that same lesson had become a barrier between them. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair, caught between her brother's anger and her father's wounded silence. She understood Michael's pride, had felt it herself when friends offered help with gentle pity in their voices. But she also saw the hurt in Jonathan's eyes, the way he seemed to shrink a little more each day. That afternoon, while organizing papers in the den, Emily discovered something that stopped her cold. Hidden behind a stack of old photo albums was a metal box, heavy and aged with an intricate lock that looked like it belonged in an antique shop. The sight of it triggered a memory. Her mother's voice, talking about treasures and secrets, about things that were kept with love and never lost. Emily carried the box to her room, studying its weathered surface. The metal was warm to the touch, as if it held some internal heat. She could hear something shifting inside when she tilted it. Papers, maybe, or small objects. The lock was ornate, requiring a key she didn't possess. The discovery sparked something in her that had been dormant for months: curiosity. When she mentioned the box to Michael that evening, his reaction surprised her with its intensity. His eyes sharpened with interest, and she could practically see his mind calculating possibilities. They were both drowning in debt, and the presence of a locked box in their father's house felt loaded with potential significance. "Did you ask him about it?" Michael wanted to know. Emily shook her head. Something had held her back, a reluctance to confront their father about what felt like a secret. But Michael's expression suggested he had no such reservations. That night, Jonathan sat alone in the kitchen long after his children had retreated to their rooms. In his pocket, he fingered the small iron key that Margaret had given him decades ago. He thought about the box Emily had found, knew it was only a matter of time before questions would be asked. The key belonged to that lock, and inside the box were documents, mementos, and reminders of a life lived in partnership with someone who understood the difference between keeping and hoarding. Margaret had always said that love required faith, faith that what mattered would endure, faith that family bonds were stronger than temporary storms. But sitting alone in the kitchen where she had once hummed while cooking dinner, Jonathan wondered if faith alone was enough to bridge the growing chasm between him and the children he had raised with such hope. November. Rain drummed against the windows of the greenhouse, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the growing discord within its walls. Jonathan stood at the kitchen window, watching droplets race down the glass, each one reminding him of the tears he'd seen in Margaret's eyes during their last real conversation. She had been worried about the children even then, concerned about how they would manage without her steady presence to mediate family tensions. The confrontation he'd been dreading finally came on a gray Thursday afternoon. Michael cornered him in the den while Emily hovered uncertainly in the doorway, the metal box clutched in her hands like evidence in a trial. The sight of it sent a sharp pang through Jonathan's chest, not because of what it contained, but because of how it had been discovered, handled, examined, without permission. "We need to talk," Michael said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "About this box. About what you're not telling us." Jonathan looked from his son's determined face to his daughter's conflicted expression. Emily at least had the grace to look uncomfortable with the ambush, but she didn't retreat. The box seemed heavier in her hands now, weighted with accusations and assumptions. "It belonged to your mother," Jonathan said quietly, settling into his favorite armchair, the one Margaret had reupholstered 3 times because she refused to let him replace it. "She used it to keep special things safe." "What kind of special things?" Michael pressed, and Jonathan could hear the desperation beneath his son's aggressive tone. The debt collectors had been more persistent lately, their calls starting earlier and lasting longer. Michael was running out of time and hope, and the mysterious box represented possibility in a life that had offered precious little of it recently. Jonathan reached into his pocket and withdrew the small iron key, holding it up so the afternoon light caught its worn edges. Both children stared at it with an intensity that made him profoundly sad. When had his family become people who saw mysteries where love used to live? She called it her treasure box, he explained, his voice soft with memory. But her treasures weren't what you might expect. Against his better judgment, but unable to bear the tension crackling between them, Jonathan took the box from Emily and inserted the key. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. Inside, nestled among faded tissue paper, were the accumulated artifacts of a marriage: movie ticket stubs from their first date, a pressed corsage from their wedding, Emily's first lost tooth wrapped in a tiny envelope, a drawing Michael had made in kindergarten of their family as stick figures standing in front of a green house. Michael's face fell as he recognized the contents for what they were: mementos, not money. But Emily leaned closer, her expression softening as she picked up a yellowed envelope addressed to "My darling John" in Margaret's careful script. It was dated just 3 months before her death. "She wrote you letters?" Emily asked, her anger temporarily forgotten in the face of this tangible connection to her mother. Jonathan nodded, taking the envelope gently. Near the end, when talking became difficult, she would write down the things she wanted to make sure I remembered. About you two mostly. About how proud she was, how worried she was, how much she hoped you would find your way back to each other when times got hard. The words hung in the air like a benediction and an indictment. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his disappointment at the box's contents warring with unexpected emotion at this glimpse into his mother's final thoughts. Emily sank into the chair across from her father, the weight of their recent treatment of him settling on her shoulders like lead. "I know you're both struggling," Jonathan continued, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "I know you're angry and scared and tired of pretending everything will be all right, but your mother believed that families survive by holding on to each other, not by letting fear drive them apart." Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Jonathan recognized from his son's childhood when frustration overwhelmed him. "It's not that simple, Dad. You don't understand what it's like to lose everything, to feel like a failure every single day." The irony of those words struck Jonathan like a physical blow. He looked around the den, at the photographs chronicling a lifetime of love and loss, at the empty chair where Margaret used to sit reading her mystery novels, at the children who had once run to him with scraped knees and broken hearts. "I don't understand failure," he asked quietly. "I've watched my wife die slowly, unable to save her. I've seen my children return home broken and hurting, unable to fix what's wrong in their lives. I've become a stranger in my own house with people I love treating me like an inconvenience. If that's not failure, I don't know what is." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back, and Michael stared at the floor as if it might offer answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. The rain continued its steady drumbeat against the windows, washing the last of autumn's colors from the trees outside. Jonathan carefully returned the mementos to the box, his movements deliberate and respectful. The small iron key felt warm in his palm, heated by years of being carried close to his heart. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory, telling him that love wasn't about having all the answers. It was about choosing to keep believing in people even when they couldn't believe in themselves. But sitting in the den, surrounded by the artifacts of his marriage and the evidence of his family's fracture, Jonathan wondered if love was enough to bridge the gulf that had opened between them. The box that had once symbolized treasured memories now felt like a physical reminder of everything they had lost. Not just Margaret, but the faith in each other that had once made them whole. The moment of connection was fragile, broken by Michael's sharp intake of breath. He stared at the contents of the box with undisguised disappointment, his face cycling through emotions before settling on bitter resentment. "That's it?" he said, his voice rising. "That's what you've been hiding? Old letters and ticket stubs while we're drowning in debt?" Jonathan carefully closed the box, the small iron key heavy in his palm. The gulf between what his children needed and what he could offer had never felt wider or more insurmountable than in that moment. The aftermath of the box revelation poisoned the atmosphere in the greenhouse like smoke from a hidden fire. Michael's disappointment transformed into something darker and more corrosive, a resentment that seemed to feed on itself with each passing day. The mementos that had moved Emily to tears felt like mockery to him, symbols of a sentimental past that offered no solutions to his crushing present. Jonathan tried to return to his normal routines, but everything felt different now. The way Michael's jaw tightened when he entered a room. The way Emily avoided eye contact during their increasingly rare conversations. The sound of whispered arguments between his children that stopped abruptly when his footsteps approached. He was becoming a stranger in his own home, and the realization cut deeper than any physical pain he had ever endured. The creditor calls intensified as December approached. Michael's phone rang constantly, each conversation a fresh humiliation delivered in a house where privacy was impossible. Jonathan listened to his son's strained explanations, his increasingly desperate promises, his barely controlled fury at circumstances beyond his control. The walls of the greenhouse seemed to amplify every word, turning private shame into public spectacle. Emily's own struggles mounted as well. Her divorce proceedings had stalled over financial disputes, and potential employers continued to offer polite rejections to her applications. She moved through the house like a ghost, haunting its former life, jumping at unexpected sounds and retreating to her childhood bedroom where she could pretend the world had stopped moving forward without her. Jonathan tried offering help again, more directly this time. He mentioned his savings, his investments, the fact that the house was paid for and could be leveraged if necessary. But his words only seemed to deepen his children's resentment. Michael's pride had curdled into something bitter and defensive. Emily's gratitude was tainted with humiliation at needing rescue from her elderly father. The explosion came on a bitter evening in early December, when the heating bills and property taxes arrived on the same day as another rejection letter for Michael and a court summons for Emily. Jonathan was in the kitchen making tea when he heard raised voices from the living room, not the muffled arguments he'd grown accustomed to, but full-throated shouting that seemed to shake the walls themselves. Michael's voice carried clearly. "Tired of walking on eggshells around him. This is supposed to be temporary, but he acts like we're guests in his precious museum." Emily's response was quieter, but equally sharp. "Keep your voice down. He'll hear you." "Good. Maybe it's time someone told him the truth." Jonathan set down his teacup with hands that trembled slightly. The small iron key in his pocket felt heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge that whatever came next would change everything. He could leave, retreat to his workshop or his bedroom, pretend he hadn't heard the venom in his son's voice. But something made him walk toward the living room instead, drawn by the terrible gravity of family dissolution. He found them facing each other like combatants, their faces flushed with anger and frustration. Emily saw him first, her expression immediately shifting to embarrassment and guilt. Michael turned more slowly, his jaw set with determination that spoke of bridges being burned deliberately. "We need to talk," Michael said, his voice carrying an authority that Jonathan didn't recognize. Gone was the boy who had once sought his approval, replaced by a man whose desperation had transformed into cold resolve. About this arrangement. About what's really going on here. Jonathan remained silent, understanding instinctively that anything he said would only provide more ammunition for whatever case Michael was building against him. "You don't help," Michael continued, his words measured and deliberate. "You don't contribute anything useful. You just hover around, telling your stories, making us feel like failures for needing to be here, acting like this house is some kind of shrine to Mom that we're contaminating just by breathing the air." The accusations hung in the air like accusations themselves, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. Emily shifted uncomfortably, torn between loyalty to her father and recognition of the truth in her brother's words. Jonathan felt something inside his chest crack, not his heart exactly, but something deeper and more fundamental, his faith in the bonds that he thought were unbreakable. "If you're not going to help," Michael said, his voice rising with each word, "and you're not going to get out of the way, then maybe you should just leave. Maybe we'd all be better off if you found somewhere else to be." The words landed like physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. Jonathan looked at Emily, hoping for contradiction, for defense, for some sign that this wasn't what she wanted too. But she stared at the floor, her silence as condemning as Michael's words. Jonathan nodded slowly, understanding with painful clarity that his presence had become the problem his children needed to solve. Without a word, he turned and walked to his bedroom, closing the door behind him with the gentle click of someone who no longer belonged. The old suitcase came down from the closet shelf with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Jonathan packed methodically, taking only what was essential and leaving behind the accumulation of 78 years. His hands moved with steady purpose as he folded the few clothes he would need, selected the books that had been his companions through lonely nights, gathered the photographs that connected him to better times. The small iron key went into his coat pocket along with his father's pocket watch. Margaret's ring, the one he still wore on his finger, caught the light from the bedside lamp as he closed the suitcase. In his other pocket, He placed the letter he'd written to Margaret just days after her funeral, the one where he'd promised to take care of their children no matter what. The house was quiet when he emerged from the bedroom, his footsteps muffled by the carpet Margaret had chosen because she said it made the place feel warmer. Michael and Emily were nowhere to be seen, though he could hear the murmur of conversation from behind Emily's closed door. They were probably planning what to do with the space he would leave behind. Jonathan paused in the hallway, looking at the photographs that lined the walls. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, graduations, weddings. Evidence of a family that had once been whole, once been happy. The faces in those pictures seemed to watch him leave, and for a moment, he wavered. But Michael's words echoed in his memory. Maybe we'd all be better off if you found somewhere else to be. Perhaps his son was right. Perhaps his presence was the poison that prevented his children from healing. Perhaps love sometimes meant knowing when to step away. Jonathan walked through the greenhouse one last time, his fingers trailing along surfaces he had built with his own hands. The kitchen where Margaret had hummed while cooking Sunday dinners. The living room where they had watched their children take their first steps. The den where he had rocked both babies to sleep during endless nights when teething made rest impossible. At the front door, he paused and looked back. The small iron key in his pocket pressed against his ribs, a reminder of treasures that could be kept with love, but might still be lost. He stepped onto the porch he had rebuilt 3 times, closed the door gently behind him, and walked into the December night without looking back. The December night air cut through Jonathan's coat like a blade, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from neighboring chimneys and the promise of snow. He stood on the sidewalk outside the greenhouse, his suitcase heavy in his hand, and for the first time in his adult life, had nowhere to go. The streetlights cast long shadows between him and the house he had built, the windows glowing warmly in a way that now felt like mockery. His feet carried him automatically toward downtown Willow Creek, past houses where families were settling in for evening routines, children being tucked into bed, couples sharing quiet conversations over late dinners, televisions flickering behind drawn curtains. The normalcy of it all highlighted the surreal nature of his situation. At 78, he was homeless by choice, exiled by love, wandering streets he had walked for decades, as if seeing them for the first time. The town square opened before him, dominated by the bronze statue of some forgotten Civil War hero and surrounded by businesses that had served the community for generations. Harris Hardware, named for no relation to his family, displayed Christmas decorations in its window. The First National Bank, where he and Margaret had opened their first joint account, stood dark and imposing, and there, on the corner where it had been for 37 years, was Ben's Bakery, its windows glowing with warm light despite the late hour. Jonathan found himself drawn to the bench beneath the old oak tree in the center of the square, the same bench where he and Margaret had sat during their courtship, feeding pigeons and planning a future that had seemed limitless then. The metal was cold even through his coat, but he settled onto it anyway, setting his suitcase at his feet and staring up at the branches that had sheltered decades of his memories. Margaret had loved this spot. Even after Emily and Michael were born, she would sometimes suggest they pack a picnic and spend Sunday afternoons here, watching their children chase each other around the statue while she and Jonathan stole quiet moments between the chaos of parenting. "This is where we started," she used to say, leaning against his shoulder. "It feels right to keep coming back." The irony wasn't lost on him now. He had indeed come back, but not as the young man full of dreams who had once promised Margaret the world from this very bench. He was a broken old man whose children had decided he was better off somewhere else, anywhere else, as long as it wasn't sharing their space. Jonathan Harris? "What are you doing out here?" The voice belonged to Ben Kozlowski, owner of the bakery, a round man with flour permanently embedded under his fingernails and kindness written in the laugh lines around his eyes. He emerged from his shop carrying a bag of what smelled like fresh rolls, concern etched across his features as he took in Jonathan's suitcase and defeated posture. "Ben," Jonathan managed, his voice rougher than he'd expected. Just getting some air. Ben's eyes moved from Jonathan's face to the suitcase and back again. He had been part of Willow Creek's fabric long enough to recognize crisis when he saw it, and smart enough to know when not to ask direct questions. Instead, he settled onto the bench beside Jonathan, with the easy familiarity of someone who understood that sometimes presence mattered more than words. Cold night for sitting outside, Ben observed, pulling a thermos from his coat pocket. Coffee? The kindness in the gesture nearly undid Jonathan completely. When had he last been offered comfort without expectations or conditions attached? He accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm cup and letting the steam rise between them like incense. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, two men who had known each other peripherally for decades, but were only now discovering the deeper currents of human connection that flowed beneath surface pleasantries. Ben didn't press for explanations, and Jonathan didn't offer any. It was enough to sit with someone who asked nothing more than shared space and shared warmth. "You know," Ben said eventually, his voice carefully casual, "I've got a room above the bakery. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and quiet. Been thinking about renting it out, but haven't gotten around to advertising yet." Jonathan looked at him sharply, searching for pity or judgment in his expression. But Ben's face held only the practical kindness of someone making a straightforward business proposition. "The heating's good," Ben continued, "and there's a little kitchenette. Independent entrance around back so you wouldn't have to deal with customers coming and going. Might be perfect for someone who values privacy." The offer hung in the air between them like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. Jonathan felt something loosen in his chest, not relief exactly, but recognition that the world still contained unexpected mercy. "I couldn't impose," he began, but Ben waved him off with a flour-dusted hand. "Impose? I'd be doing you a favor? Place has been empty for months. Rather have someone decent living there than worry about pipes freezing or worse. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "Margaret would haunt my ovens if I left her husband sitting on a park bench in December." The mention of Margaret's name sent a sharp pang through Jonathan's chest, but it was accompanied by something that might have been gratitude. In all the chaos of recent months, he had forgotten that his wife's love had extended beyond their immediate family, that she had woven connections throughout the community that still held strength even in her absence. Ben stood and gestured toward the bakery. "Come on. Let me show you the place. If you don't like it, you can always come back to your bench. But at least you'll have seen your options." Jonathan followed him around the building to a narrow staircase that led to a small apartment tucked above the bakery's main space. It was indeed nothing fancy. A single room with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a kitchenette that looked like it had been installed sometime in the 1980s. But it was clean and warm, and smelled faintly of bread and cinnamon, scents that spoke of comfort and home. "What would you want for rent?" Jonathan asked, already knowing that he would accept whatever terms Ben offered. "Help in the mornings," Ben replied without hesitation. "Someone to help with the early prep work, maybe handle some deliveries for customers who can't make it in. Nothing too strenuous, just companionship, really. Gets lonely working by yourself at 4 in the morning." Jonathan set down his suitcase and looked around the small space that might become his new home. Through the single window, he could see the green house in the distance, its porch light still glowing like a beacon he would never again follow home. "When could I start?" he asked. Ben's smile was answer enough. Dawn came early in the world above Ben's bakery, announced not by alarm clocks but by the gentle sounds of ovens warming and dough being kneaded in the kitchen below. Jonathan woke to these rhythms as naturally as he had once woken to Margaret's quiet movements around their bedroom, and found in them an unexpected comfort. The small apartment had become more than shelter in the 3 weeks since his exile. It had become a sanctuary where his worth wasn't measured by his failures as a father. His morning routine began before sunrise, when the world outside was still wrapped in winter darkness, and the streets of Willow Creek lay empty except for the occasional delivery truck. Jonathan would dress quietly, make a simple breakfast in his tiny kitchenette, and descend the narrow stairs to begin his work alongside Ben. There was something deeply satisfying about arriving before the world woke up, about being part of the quiet army that prepared the day's sustenance while others slept. Ben had proved to be an ideal companion, present when conversation was needed, comfortably silent when it wasn't. He never asked about the circumstances that had brought Jonathan to his door, never probed into the family drama that had resulted in a 78-year-old man living above a bakery. Instead, he offered patient instruction in the rhythms of commercial baking, shared stories of his own immigration from Poland 40 years earlier, and created space for Jonathan to exist without judgment or expectation. The work itself was physical but not demanding. Jonathan swept floors, packaged bread loaves in crisp white bags, arranged pastries in the display case with an attention to detail that came naturally to someone who had spent decades in precision craftsmanship. His hands, which had built houses and repaired countless broken things, adapted quickly to the gentler tasks of arranging cinnamon rolls and tying bakery boxes with string. But it was the customers who surprised him most. Word had spread through Willow Creek's informal communication network that Jonathan Harris was working at Ben's bakery, and people began arriving with purposes that extended beyond purchasing bread. Mrs. Peterson, who lived 6 blocks away and had never exchanged more than pleasantries with Jonathan in 30 years of being neighbors, started stopping by twice weekly for coffee and conversation. Tom Bradley, recently widowed and struggling with loneliness, discovered a need for fresh rolls that coincided perfectly with Jonathan's morning shifts. These interactions revealed something that Jonathan had forgotten during the dark months in the greenhouse. He was valued by people beyond his immediate family. His knowledge of local history, his memories of how the town had evolved over decades, his gentle way of listening to problems without offering unwanted advice, these qualities found appreciation among the bakery's regular customers in ways that felt both surprising and deeply healing. One particular morning, while arranging the day's selection of cookies, Jonathan found himself in conversation with Sarah Chen, a young mother who had recently moved to Willow Creek from the city. She was struggling with the isolation that often accompanied small-town life for newcomers, missing the anonymity and energy of urban existence, while trying to appreciate the slower pace her husband had promised would be better for their children. "The problem," she confided while her toddler explored the bakery's child-friendly corners, "is that everyone knows everyone here, but I don't know anyone. It's like being invisible in a room full of people who are all looking at each other." Jonathan listened while continuing his work, understanding her dilemma from his own recent experience of becoming invisible within his own family. "Community takes time," he offered gently. "It's not something you can rush or force. But once it takes hold, it becomes something worth having." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emily, who appeared in the bakery's doorway with an expression of uncertainty mixed with determination. Jonathan's hands stilled on the cookie tray as their eyes met across the small space. She looked thinner than when he'd left, her face drawn with stress that hadn't improved in his absence. "Dad," she said simply, her voice carefully controlled. "Could we talk?" Ben, with the intuitive understanding that came from years of observing human drama unfold in his establishment, immediately busied himself in the kitchen, leaving father and daughter with the privacy their conversation would require. Sarah Chen gathered her toddler and left with mumbled excuses about remembering an appointment. Emily approached the counter hesitantly, as if she wasn't certain of her welcome. In her hands, she carried an envelope that looked like it had been opened and refolded several times. "I came to apologize," she began, her words coming in a rush as if she'd rehearsed them. "For that night, for not defending you, for letting Michael say those things. I've been wanting to come sooner, but I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me." Jonathan studied his daughter's face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Her presence here, in his new sanctuary, felt both natural and strange, a piece of his old life appearing in the context of his new reality. "You don't need to apologize," he said quietly. "You were trying to survive a difficult situation. I understand that." Emily's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "No, I do need to apologize, because what Michael said was cruel and wrong, and I should have stood up for you, should have reminded him that you opened your home to us when we had nowhere else to go, should have told him that being angry doesn't give him the right to be vicious." She placed the envelope on the counter between them. "This came for you yesterday, from the bank. I thought it might be important." Jonathan recognized the logo of First National, where he had maintained accounts for decades. Official mail from financial institutions typically meant quarterly statements or investment updates, routine business that he had forgotten to redirect to his new address. "How are things?" he asked, instead of reaching for the envelope immediately. "At the house with Michael?" Emily's laugh held no humor. "Awful. We're barely speaking to each other. The house feels cold all the time, no matter how high we turn the heat, and everything reminds us of you, of what we did, of how badly we handled everything. Michael won't admit it, but I think he's starting to realize that pushing you away didn't solve anything. If anything, it made everything worse." Through the bakery's window, Jonathan could see Ben sweeping the sidewalk with unnecessary vigor, clearly giving them as much time as they needed. A few regular customers had gathered outside, waiting for the shop to officially open, their breath visible in the cold morning air. "I miss you," Emily said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I miss your stories. I miss your terrible jokes. I miss feeling like someone in that house actually wanted me there. Michael and we're just two broken people making each other more broken. Without you there to be the adult, we don't know how to take care of each other." Jonathan felt the familiar ache of parental love, complicated now by the knowledge of how fragile family bonds could be when tested by desperation and pride. Emily was offering him something, not quite an invitation to return, but recognition of what had been lost when he left. The envelope from First National Bank lay unopened on Jonathan's small table for 3 days after Emily's visit, like an unexploded ordnance in the tidy sanctuary of his apartment. He found himself circling around it during his quiet evening hours, sensing that its contents might demand decisions he wasn't ready to make. The conversation with Emily had cracked something open inside him, not hope exactly, but a recognition that the story between him and his children wasn't necessarily finished. Emily had begun stopping by the bakery twice a week, always timing her visits for the late morning lull when customer traffic was light and conversation was possible. She would order coffee she didn't really want and pastries she barely touched, using purchased goods as an excuse to linger near the counter where her father arranged the day's offerings with careful precision. These visits felt tentative and fragile, like birds learning to trust a hand that had once been safe but might not be anymore. During one such visit, she mentioned that she had been writing letters to him, long, rambling letters that attempted to explain her behavior, her silence during that terrible confrontation with Michael, her struggle to balance loyalty to her brother with love for her father. But she couldn't bring herself to deliver them, wasn't sure he would want to read accusations against himself written in her careful script. "I understand," Jonathan told her. And he did. The space between intention and action was filled with pride and fear, emotions that he recognized from his own sleepless nights, spent composing conversations that would never happen. Michael remained notably absent from these tentative reconciliations. According to Emily, he had doubled down on his conviction that Jonathan's departure had been necessary and beneficial. He refused to acknowledge any regret for his words, insisted that the atmosphere in the greenhouse had improved since their father left, claimed that the family was better off without the weight of obligation and expectation that Jonathan's presence had imposed. But Emily's descriptions of her brother's behavior suggested a different reality. Michael had become increasingly isolated, leaving the house early and returning late, avoiding the common spaces where memories of their father's presence lingered most strongly. He had taken over Jonathan's workshop in the basement, ostensibly to pursue job-related projects, but Emily suspected he went there primarily to escape the guilt that had settled into the house like dust. The truth was that both children were struggling in ways that Jonathan's departure had only exacerbated. Emily's divorce proceedings had stalled completely, her lawyer citing her client's inability to focus during crucial negotiations. Michael's job search had become increasingly desperate, his interviews marked by a bitter edge that potential employers found off-putting. They were feeding off each other's despair, trapped in a cycle of resentment and self-destruction that Jonathan's steadying presence might have interrupted. It was during his 4th week at the bakery that Jonathan first noticed the symptoms: a persistent cough that rattled his chest during the early morning hours, a shortness of breath that came without exertion, an exhaustion that seemed to seep into his bones regardless of how much rest he got. He attributed these discomforts to the adjustment of sleeping in a new place, to the emotional stress of family separation, to the simple fact of being 78 years old and expecting his body to adapt to change. Ben noticed first, commenting on the way Jonathan paused to catch his breath after climbing the stairs to his apartment, the way his color seemed gray despite spending his mornings in the warm, well-lit bakery. When Jonathan coughed up blood one morning while packaging dinner rolls, Ben's concern shifted to alarm. "You need to see a doctor," Ben said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "That's not a normal cough, Jonathan. That's not something you ignore." The emergency room at Willow Creek Regional Hospital was a sterile contrast to the warm familiarity of the bakery, all bright lights and antiseptic smells that reminded Jonathan sharply of Margaret's final months. The young doctor who examined him had kind eyes but a serious expression as he explained the results of the chest X-ray and blood work. "Advanced congestive heart failure," the doctor said, speaking slowly to ensure understanding. "Your heart is working much harder than it should be to pump blood through your system. The fluid in your lungs is causing the breathing difficulties and the cough." Jonathan listened to the explanation of treatment options: medications to manage symptoms, lifestyle changes to reduce strain on his cardiovascular system, the realistic acknowledgement that this was a progressive condition that would worsen over time. The doctor spoke about quality of life, about managing expectations, about the importance of having support systems in place for the challenges ahead. "How long?" Jonathan asked simply. The doctor's hesitation was answer enough. Months, maybe a year if the medications proved effective. The precise timeline would depend on how well his body responded to treatment, how diligently he followed medical recommendations, how much fight his tired heart had left in it. Jonathan returned to the bakery apartment that evening with a bag of medications and a new understanding of his limited time. The envelope from the bank still lay unopened on his table, but now it felt less like a potential crisis and more like a task that needed completing before other decisions became impossible. Inside the envelope was a quarterly statement showing account balances that would surprise his children. Investments that he and Margaret had accumulated over decades of careful saving, life insurance policies that had matured, the proceeds from various financial instruments that they had, purchased during better times and forgotten about in their retirement years. The numbers on the page represented not wealth exactly, but security that could transform his children's circumstances if properly applied. Jonathan sat at his small table and began to write letters, not the emotional appeals that Emily had struggled to send, but practical documents that would ensure his wishes were clearly understood, regardless of what happened to their relationship in the time he had remaining. He wrote to Andrew Collins, the family lawyer who had handled his and Margaret's legal affairs for 20 years. He wrote instructions for the distribution of assets, the payment of debts, the handling of property that had been accumulating value while his children struggled with poverty. But mostly he wrote to Margaret, composing in his mind the conversation they would have if she were sitting across from him at this tiny table, helping him navigate the complex intersection of love and justice that parenthood demanded even after children became adults. She would want him to forgive, he knew. She would want the family healed before healing became impossible. The question was whether forgiveness could bridge the distance that pride and pain had created, and whether love alone was strong enough to overcome the damage that desperation had done to the bonds between them. January in Willow Creek brought the kind of cold that seemed to reach through walls and windows, settling into bones that were already tired. Jonathan's condition deteriorated with the weather, each morning requiring more effort to rise from bed, more determination to make his way down the narrow stairs to begin his work in the bakery. The medications helped, but they fought a losing battle against a heart that had simply carried too much for too long. Ben watched his friend's decline with the helpless concern of someone who understood that some problems couldn't be solved with kindness and good intentions. He began arriving at the bakery earlier, taking on tasks that Jonathan had handled with ease just weeks before. The morning routine shifted subtly. Jonathan now focused on lighter duties, the detailed work that could be done while sitting, while Ben handled the physical demands of lifting and moving that had become increasingly difficult. The customers noticed, too, though they were tactful in their observations. Mrs. Peterson brought soup that she claimed was extra from her own dinner, though Jonathan suspected she had made it specifically for him. Tom Bradley lingered longer during his visits, sensing that their conversations about local history and shared memories had taken on a different quality, the urgency of stories that needed to be told while time remained for telling. Jonathan made his first visit to Andrew Collins' law office on a Tuesday morning when the snow fell in fat, lazy flakes that reminded him of the winter Emily was born. The lawyer's office occupied the second floor of a building that had housed various businesses over the decades, its windows offering a view of the town square where Jonathan had spent countless hours with Margaret planning their future. Andrew Collins was a methodical man who had guided the Harris family through various legal necessities over the years: property purchases, will updates, the paperwork that accompanied Margaret's death. He listened without interruption as Jonathan explained his current living situation, his medical diagnosis, and his intentions for the handling of his estate. "This is quite substantial," Andrew observed, reviewing the financial documents that Jonathan had gathered. The numbers represented a lifetime of careful saving, investments that had grown over decades, insurance policies that had accumulated significant value. "Your children have no idea about these assets?" Jonathan shook his head. He and Margaret had always been private about their finances, believing that their children should make their own way in the world without the distraction of anticipated inheritance. But privacy had become secrecy, and now that secrecy felt more like a burden than a virtue. "I want to make some changes," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the effort it took to speak clearly, "to how things will be distributed. There are some specific bequests I want to arrange." They spent the morning crafting documents that would reflect Jonathan's complicated feelings about family, forgiveness, and the lessons that could only be learned through loss. The legal language felt inadequate to capture the emotional complexity of his decisions, but Andrew translated his intentions into precise terms that would leave no room for ambiguity. The most significant change involved the house itself. Rather than leaving it jointly to Michael and Emily, Jonathan decided to gift it to them immediately, transferring ownership while he was still alive to see how they would handle the responsibility. The financial assets, however, would tell a different story entirely. That evening, Jonathan called Emily from his apartment, asking her to meet him at the bakery the following morning. His voice carried a formality that she hadn't heard since childhood, the tone he had used when serious conversations were necessary. She arrived early, before the bakery opened, finding her father sitting at one of the small tables near the window with papers spread before him like evidence in a case. The early morning light revealed how much weight he had lost, how the clothes that had fit properly just weeks before now hung loose on his diminished frame. "I need to tell you some things," Jonathan began without preamble. "About my health, about some decisions I've made. And I need you to listen without arguing or trying to fix anything, because some things can't be fixed." Emily felt her chest tighten with anticipation. Her father's careful tone, the formal arrangement of papers, the unusual request for an early meeting, All of it suggested news that she wasn't prepared to receive. Jonathan explained his diagnosis matter-of-factly, describing the heart condition and its prognosis with the same directness he had once used to explain the mechanics of plumbing or electricity to his curious children. Emily's face cycled through shock, denial, and heartbreak as she processed the implications of what he was telling her. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A few weeks, since Ben made me see a doctor about the coughing." "And you didn't tell us? You didn't think we had a right to know?" Jonathan looked at his daughter steadily. "After what happened in December, I wasn't sure you would want to know. I wasn't sure it would matter to you whether I lived or died." The words hit Emily like physical blows, each one finding its mark in her already guilty conscience. She began to cry. Not the careful, controlled tears she had shed during their previous conversations, but the raw, devastating sobs of someone confronting the magnitude of what had been lost and what couldn't be recovered. "Of course it matters," she managed through her tears. "Of course we want to know. Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Jonathan reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers thin but still strong. "I know you are. And I forgive you. I forgave you before you ever asked, because that's what parents do. But forgiveness doesn't change the situation we're in now." He explained about the house, about the deed transfer that would give her and Michael ownership immediately rather than requiring them to wait for his death. It was, he said, a gesture of faith. Faith that they could learn to work together. Faith that they could honor the home that had sheltered 4 generations of their family. "But the other assets," he continued, his voice growing stronger with resolution, "those will go elsewhere, to places that will use them to help people who need help, who understand the value of what they're receiving." Emily stared at him in confusion. "What other assets?" "Dad, what are you talking about?" Jonathan pulled out the bank statements, the investment reports, the documentation of a financial legacy that Emily had never suspected existed. Her eyes widened as she processed the numbers, understanding for the first time that her father's modest lifestyle had masked substantial wealth. "This could solve everything," she said, her voice rising with excitement and hope. "The debts, Michael's situation, my divorce, all of it could be fixed." "It could," Jonathan agreed quietly. "But it won't be. That money is going to the Willow Creek Senior Home, to help people who understand the importance of treating each other with dignity and respect." The bakery fell silent, except for the sound of Emily's breathing, quick and shallow as she absorbed the full impact of her father's decision. He was giving away their inheritance, deliberately choosing to benefit strangers rather than his own children. It was a level of rejection that made his physical exile from the greenhouse seem minor by comparison. "This is punishment," Emily said finally, her voice hollow. "This is your way of punishing us for that night." Jonathan considered her words carefully before responding. "No," he said. "This is my way of teaching you what I should have taught you years ago. That love and money are different things, and that you can't buy your way out of the consequences of how you treat people. Your mother and I gave you everything we thought you needed. We forgot to give you the experience of want, of having to earn what you received. This is my last chance to give you that gift." The revelation of Jonathan's financial decision struck Emily like a physical blow, leaving her sitting in stunned silence as the implications settled around her like debris after an explosion. $8 million, a sum that could have erased every debt, solved every problem, provided security for decades, was being donated to strangers while she and Michael struggled to keep their heads above water. "You can't do this," she said finally, her voice shaking with emotions she couldn't separate or name. "You can't just give everything away because you're angry at us. That's not fair. That's not what Mom would have wanted." Jonathan's expression didn't change, but Emily saw something flicker behind his eyes at the mention of Margaret. "Your mother would have wanted you to grow into people who could stand on their own feet, who understood that love isn't something you can take for granted. She would have wanted you to learn the difference between being supported and being enabled. But she also would have wanted us to be family," Emily shot back, desperation making her voice sharp. She wouldn't have wanted you to die alone in an apartment above a bakery while your children struggled to survive. She wouldn't have wanted this distance between us. The accuracy of Emily's words stung because Jonathan knew they contained truth. Margaret had valued family above everything else, had worked tirelessly to maintain connections even when relationships became difficult. Her final letter, the one he kept in the metal box, spoke specifically about hoping her children would find their way back to each other during hard times. But Margaret had also died before seeing how completely their children would forget the values she had tried to instill, before witnessing the cruel words and casual cruelty that desperation had made possible. She hadn't seen Michael's face when he demanded that his father leave, hadn't heard Emily's silence in the face of emotional violence. "If she were here," Jonathan said quietly, "this conversation wouldn't be necessary. You and Michael would never have spoken to her the way you spoke to me that night. You would never have told her to leave her own home because her presence inconvenienced you." Emily buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the weight of recognition. He was right, and they both knew it. Margaret's presence had been a civilizing force in their family, a buffer between difficult personalities and a reminder of higher standards of behavior. Without her moderating influence, they had reverted to their worst impulses when stress made cooperation difficult. "What if we changed?" Emily asked suddenly, lifting her head to meet her father's eyes. "What if Michael apologized? What if we proved that we could be better? Would you reconsider?" Jonathan studied his daughter's face, seeing in it the little girl who had once promised to clean her room if only she could have a puppy, who had sworn to practice piano every day if only he would sign her up for lessons. The bargaining was familiar, but the stakes had never been this high. "Emily," he said gently, "I'm dying. Even if you and Michael transformed overnight into the people your mother and I hoped you would become, I don't have enough time left to enjoy that transformation. These decisions aren't about punishment or reward. They're about accepting reality." The word dying hung between them like a barrier that couldn't be crossed or circumvented. Emily had heard the medical explanation, had processed the timeline that her father's doctor had provided, but somehow she had avoided confronting the brutal finality of what those words actually meant. "How long?" she whispered. "Months. Maybe less if the medications stop being effective." Emily began to cry again, but these tears were different, quieter, more desperate, carrying the weight of time that couldn't be recovered and conversations that had been postponed until too late. Jonathan reached across the table and took her hand again, noting how much it resembled Margaret's at the same age. "I want to tell Michael," Emily said suddenly, "about your condition, about the money, about everything. He has a right to know what's happening." Jonathan nodded. He had expected this, had hoped that Emily would take responsibility for bridging the gap that his own pride had made too difficult to cross directly. "You can tell him whatever you think is appropriate. But Emily, don't expect this information to change his mind about me. Don't use my illness as a weapon to make him feel guilty. That's not fair to either of us." After Emily left, Jonathan sat alone in the bakery as Ben prepared for the morning rush of customers. The conversation had drained him more than he wanted to admit, and the familiar ache in his chest seemed deeper than usual. He thought about Margaret's metal box, still sitting on his table upstairs, with its collection of memories and the small iron key that she had claimed opened doors to happiness. Maybe she had been right about the key's power, but wrong about which doors it opened. Maybe happiness wasn't about accumulating treasures or maintaining perfect relationships, but about making peace with the choices that shaped a life, even when those choices led to loneliness and loss. That evening, Emily delivered the news to Michael with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. She found him in their father's old workshop, surrounded by half-finished projects and tools that still smelled faintly of Jonathan's aftershave. The conversation that followed was explosive and devastating. Michael's initial reaction was disbelief, then anger, then a complicated mixture of guilt and defiance that left him pacing the small space like a caged animal. The information about Jonathan's financial assets particularly enraged him, not because the money was being donated, but because its existence had been hidden from them while they struggled with debt and desperation. "He let us suffer," Michael said, his voice tight with fury. "He watched us lose everything while sitting on enough money to solve all our problems." "What kind of father does that?" Emily tried to explain their father's reasoning, the lessons about self-reliance and earned success that Jonathan had tried to articulate. But Michael heard only betrayal and manipulation, saw only a parent who had withheld help when it was desperately needed. The argument that followed was even more devastating than the one that had led to Jonathan's exile. Michael accused Emily of being manipulated by guilt and sentiment. Emily accused Michael of being too proud and stubborn to admit his own mistakes. They said things to each other that siblings should never say, crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. By the time their anger burned itself out, both were exhausted and more isolated than ever. The greenhouse felt even colder, if that were possible, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of better times when family meant safety rather than warfare. But late that night, alone in his childhood bedroom, Michael finally allowed himself to confront the truth that he had been avoiding since December. He had driven his dying father away from the home they had built together, had chosen pride over love when love was what everyone needed most. The question now was whether there was enough time left to matter, and whether forgiveness was possible when it came so close to too late. The February night when Jonathan's health took its final turn was marked by a quietness that seemed to settle over Willow Creek like a blanket. Ben found him collapsed in his apartment bathroom at 3 a.m, called there by sounds of distress that penetrated the thin walls between the bakery and the living space above. The ambulance ride to Willow Creek Regional Hospital was a blur of oxygen masks and urgent whispers, medical personnel working to stabilize a heart that had simply reached the end of its endurance. Emily received the call at 4:30. Ben's voice tight with worry as he explained what had happened and where Jonathan had been taken. She drove through empty streets with hands that shook on the steering wheel, her mind cycling between prayer and panic as she tried to process the reality that the conversation about time running out had become immediate and urgent. Michael wasn't at the hospital. Emily had called the greenhouse repeatedly during the drive, letting the phone ring until the answering machine picked up, leaving messages that grew increasingly desperate. When she finally found him, hours later, he was sitting in their father's workshop with a bottle of whiskey and an expression of such profound defeat that she almost didn't recognize him. "He's asking for you," Emily said without preamble. "Dad's asking for you to come to the hospital." Michael looked up at his sister with eyes that were red-rimmed and hollow. The workshop around him bore evidence of a violent outburst. Tools scattered across the floor, half-finished projects overturned, the careful organization that Jonathan had maintained destroyed by someone who needed to break something but couldn't bring himself to break anything truly irreplaceable. "What's the point?" Michael said, his words slightly slurred but his meaning clear. "What's the point of going there to watch him die knowing what I said to him? Knowing that the last real conversation we had was me telling him to leave." Emily sat down on the workbench across from her brother, noting the way he cradled the bottle like it was providing comfort instead of just numbness. "The point is that he's still our father and he's dying, and we only get one chance to say goodbye. He doesn't want to see me," Michael continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Why would he want to see me? I'm the one who destroyed everything. I'm the one who was so worried about my own problems that I couldn't see his. I'm the one who made him pack a suitcase and leave the house he built with his own hands." The weight of guilt that Michael had been carrying since December had finally become too heavy to bear. The alcohol had loosened the restraints he usually kept on his emotions, allowing the full scope of his regret to surface. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside, leaving only the shell of someone who had once been strong and confident. Emily reached for the bottle and gently took it away from him, setting it aside despite his weak protest. "He forgives you," she said quietly. "I don't know if that makes it better or worse, but he forgives you. He told me so." "That makes it worse," Michael whispered. "That makes it so much worse because I don't deserve it." Michael talked about the shame that had eaten away at him since losing his job, the feeling of failure that grew stronger with each rejection letter, each unpaid bill, each day spent living in his childhood bedroom like a teenager who had never successfully launched into adulthood. Emily shared her own struggles, the humiliation of her marriage falling apart, the terror of losing the business she had built, the way she had projected her anger onto their father because it was easier than admitting her own mistakes. I don't deserve forgiveness for what I did. The conversation that followed was the most honest they had shared since childhood, before pride and competition had complicated their relationship. They were two middle-aged people who had never learned to handle failure gracefully, who had been protected by their parents' love and Margaret's wisdom until circumstances forced them to confront their own inadequacies. I wanted to be angry at him, Michael admitted. It felt better than being angry at myself, and when I found out about the money, about how much he had while we were struggling, it felt like proof that he didn't care about us as much as we thought. But that's not what it was, Emily said softly. It was him trying to force us to grow up, to become people Mom would have been proud of. He was trying to save us from becoming the kind of people who only valued him for what he could provide. Michael was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of Emily's words. In the silence, they could hear the house settling around them, the creaks and sighs of a structure that had sheltered their family for decades, but now felt empty and cold despite their presence within it. I need to go see him, Michael said finally, his voice steadier than it had been all evening. Even if he can't forgive me, even if it's too late to fix anything, I need to try. They drove to the hospital together through the pre-dawn darkness, siblings united by crisis in a way they hadn't been since childhood. The cardiac care unit was quiet except for the sounds of monitoring equipment and the soft conversations of medical staff working the night shift. Jonathan lay connected to machines that measured the failing rhythms of his heart, his face gray with exhaustion but peaceful in a way that suggested he had found some form of acceptance. When he opened his eyes and saw both of his children standing beside his bed, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a quiet satisfaction that suggested pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. "Michael," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the medical equipment. "You came." Michael nodded, unable to trust his voice for several moments. When he finally spoke, the words came out in a rush. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry for what I said, for making you leave, for being too proud and stupid to see what I was doing to all of us." Jonathan moved his hand slightly on the hospital blanket, and Michael understood the gesture as an invitation. He took his father's hand in both of his own, noting how light it felt, how fragile the bones seemed beneath skin that had once been strong enough to build houses and fix everything that broke. "I forgive you," Jonathan whispered. "I love you, both of you." That never changed, not even when everything else fell apart. The three of them spent the remaining hours before dawn talking quietly, sharing memories and apologies, and the kind of honest conversation that should have happened months earlier but was still meaningful despite coming so late. Jonathan spoke about Margaret, about the letters she had written near the end expressing her faith that their children would find their way back to each other when it mattered most. As the sun began to rise over Willow Creek, casting pale light through the hospital windows, Jonathan closed his eyes for the last time, surrounded by the children he had loved imperfectly but completely, forgiven despite their failures, and mourned before his death by people who had learned too late what they had lost when pride replaced love as the governing principle of their family. Jonathan Harris passed away at 6:47 on that February morning, his breathing simply stopping as naturally as it had sustained him for 78 years. Emily felt his hand grow still in hers, while Michael stood frozen beside the hospital bed, both of them finally understanding that some endings come without dramatic flourishes or final words of wisdom. Death, they discovered, could be as quiet and dignified as the life that preceded it. The hospital staff moved with practiced efficiency, their voices lowered to respectful whispers as they completed the necessary procedures and documentation. A young nurse gently suggested that the family take their time saying goodbye, that there was no rush to leave, that grief required its own schedule independent of institutional timelines. Emily continued holding her father's hand long after warmth had faded from his fingers, as if her touch could somehow maintain a connection that death had severed. Michael stood at the window watching the sun rise over Willow Creek, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs that he had kept locked away for months. The hospital room felt simultaneously empty and overfull, empty of the man who had given it meaning, overfull with regret and love that had arrived too late to matter. Ben arrived before the formal visiting hours began, somehow having learned of Jonathan's death through the informal networks that connected small-town businesses. His presence was a comfort neither sibling had expected to need, a reminder that their father's life had extended beyond the boundaries of family dysfunction into a community that valued his quiet contributions. He was at peace these last weeks, Ben told them as they sat in the family waiting area, trying to process the logistics of death, funeral arrangements, notifications, the 100 small decisions that death imposed on the living. Working in the bakery gave him purpose, and your visits, Emily, gave him hope that reconciliation was possible. The word reconciliation hung in the air like an accusation. Michael had managed only one real conversation with his father before death intervened, one moment of forgiveness that felt insufficient to balance months of cruelty and neglect. Emily had tried to rebuild their relationship, but her efforts had been tentative and incomplete, hobbled by pride and the assumption that time was unlimited. Word of Jonathan's death spread through Willow Creek with remarkable speed. By midday, the funeral home was fielding calls from people Emily and Michael barely knew. Customers from the bakery, neighbors who had watched Jonathan maintain his house and garden for decades. Fellow church members who remembered his faithful attendance and quiet generosity. The scope of their father's connections revealed how isolated their family had become, how their recent troubles had blinded them to the broader community that had valued Jonathan's presence. The funeral 3 days later overflowed St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, with attendees spilling into the vestibule and clustering on the front steps despite February's bitter cold. Emily and Michael sat in the front pew feeling like strangers at their own father's service, listening to stories about a man whose kindness had touched dozens of lives in ways they had never suspected. Ben spoke with characteristic directness about Jonathan's final months, describing his transition from grieving widower to valued community member with the matter-of-fact appreciation of someone who had witnessed quiet heroism firsthand. Mrs. Peterson shared memories of Jonathan's help during her husband's illness. Tom Bradley talked about conversations on the town square bench that had helped him navigate his own widowhood. But the most surprising tribute came from residents of the Willow Creek Senior Home, elderly men and women who had somehow learned of Jonathan's death despite never having met him. They came to honor a stranger whose generosity, they had been told, would transform their living conditions in ways they were only beginning to understand. The reading of Jonathan's will took place the following Tuesday in Andrew Collins's law office, a cramped space above the hardware store that smelled of old paper and decades of accumulated legal business. Emily and Michael sat across from Andrew's desk with the resigned expressions of people who had already lost everything that mattered and were simply waiting for the formal confirmation of their father's judgment. Andrew's voice was steady and professional as he read the document Jonathan had crafted during his final weeks of life. The house on Maple Street would indeed pass to them jointly, along with personal possessions and a small checking account sufficient to cover immediate expenses. But then came the devastating core of their father's final message. Regarding the investments, savings, and other financial assets accumulated during my marriage to Margaret Harris, Andrew read, his voice deliberately neutral. Totaling $8,400,000, I make the following bequest. My children, Michael and Emily, will receive nothing. This is not punishment. This is education. The words struck like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to inflict maximum emotional impact. Emily felt the air leave her lungs as if she had been punched. Michael stared at the wall behind Andrew's desk, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and devastating recognition. "The entire amount," Andrew continued, "is to be donated to the Willow Creek Senior Home for the construction of a new residential wing to be named the Jonathan and Margaret Harris Memorial Pavilion. These funds will provide housing and care for elderly residents who understand the value of treating each other with dignity and respect." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Outside, normal life continued, cars passing, people conducting ordinary Tuesday afternoon business. But inside Andrew's office, two middle-aged adults were confronting the full scope of their father's disappointment in their character. "There is one personal item," Andrew said gently, reaching into his desk drawer. "He wanted you to have this." He placed a familiar object on the desk between them, their father's pocket watch, the timepiece that had belonged to 3 generations of Harris men. Emily reached for it with trembling hands, immediately noticing that it had stopped working. The hands were frozen at 6:47, the exact moment of Jonathan's death. The symbolism was unmistakable. Time had run out for proving themselves worthy of the love they had rejected. "He said," Andrew added softly, "that while money could be earned or lost or given away, time was the only inheritance that truly mattered, and he hoped that understanding would come to you before your own time ran out." Michael stood abruptly and walked to the small window overlooking Main Street, his shoulders rigid with emotions he couldn't yet process. $8 million. A fortune that could have solved every problem, erased every debt, provided security for the rest of their lives. Gone. Deliberately, systematically, irrevocably gone. "He watched us struggle," Michael said finally, his voice hollow. "He knew we were drowning financially, and he sat on $8 million rather than help us." "He was trying to save you," Andrew replied quietly. "From becoming people who valued money more than family, who treated love as a transaction rather than a gift. He wanted you to learn what your mother tried to teach you. That character matters more than comfort." Emily clutched the stopped watch, finally understanding the magnitude of what they had lost. Not just financial security, though that would have transformed their lives. They had lost their father's faith in their basic decency, his belief that they could choose love over selfishness when tested by adversity. As they left Andrew's office that February afternoon, the pocket watch heavy in Emily's purse like a physical reminder of time wasted and opportunities squandered, both siblings understood that their father's final lesson was complete. They had learned what it meant to lose something irreplaceable. Whether that lesson could transform them into people worthy of the love they had rejected remained to be seen. The weeks following Jonathan's funeral passed in a haze of practical necessities and emotional reckoning. Emily and Michael moved through the greenhouse like ghosts haunting their own childhood, surrounded by belongings that now carried the weight of finality. Every room held reminders of their father's presence: his reading glasses on the kitchen table, his coffee mug in the sink, the impression his body had left in his favorite chair. The house itself seemed different without Jonathan's steady presence. Sounds carried differently through rooms that had lost their central organizing principle. The heating system rattled more noticeably, as if protesting the absence of someone who understood its quirks and maintenance needs. Windows that Jonathan had cleaned weekly now accumulated dust and fingerprints that no one felt motivated to address. Emily found herself drawn repeatedly to their father's bedroom, which neither sibling had entered since his departure in December. His clothes still hung in the closet, arranged with the methodical precision that had characterized all his habits. The bed was made with military corners, the dresser top clear except for a small framed photograph of Margaret and a leather-bound journal that Emily hadn't noticed before. The journal proved to be a record of Jonathan's final months. Not a daily diary, but periodic reflections on family, forgiveness, and the lessons that parenthood continued to offer even when children became adults. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, each entry composed with the thoughtfulness of someone who understood that his words might be the last communication he left behind. One entry, dated just days before his death, was addressed directly to his children. "I know you will read this eventually, and I know you will be angry about the money. That anger is part of the lesson. For most of your lives, you have been protected from the consequences of your choices by Margaret's love and my willingness to solve your problems. We meant well, but we created adults who expect rescue rather than developing the strength to rescue themselves. Love without accountability becomes enabling. I pray that losing my support will teach you to find strength you didn't know you possessed." Michael discovered the journal first, during a reluctant search through their father's possessions to determine what needed to be saved or discarded. His initial reaction was fury, rage at being lectured from beyond the grave, anger at their father's presumption that financial manipulation could correct character flaws, resentment that death had given Jonathan the final word in their relationship. But as he continued reading, Michael's anger gradually transformed into something more complex and uncomfortable. Entry after entry revealed a parent wrestling with the balance between love and tough love, between supporting his children and enabling their worst tendencies. Jonathan's words showed not cruelty, but anguish, the pain of a father who watched his children make self-destructive choices and struggled to determine when helping became hindering. Emily's response to the journal was immediate and overwhelming. She sat on their father's bed reading his careful observations about her marriage, her business, her tendency to blame external circumstances rather than examining her own contributions to her failures. The words were gentle but relentless, delivered with the surgical precision of someone who had observed her closely enough to see patterns she couldn't recognize herself. The most difficult passage was Jonathan's analysis of the night he had been forced to leave. Emily's silence during Michael's attack was perhaps the most devastating part of that evening. Not because I expected her to defend me against her brother's anger, but because her inability to speak truth to someone she loved revealed how conflict avoidant she has become. She has learned to preserve peace at the expense of honesty, to maintain relationships by avoiding difficult conversations. This pattern destroyed her marriage and will destroy other relationships until she learns that love sometimes requires uncomfortable courage. The accuracy of the observation was painful precisely because Emily recognized its truth. Her marriage had indeed failed partly because she had avoided confronting problems until they became irreparable. Her business had suffered because she had been unable to have difficult conversations with employees and customers. Her relationship with Michael had deteriorated because she had chosen silence over the hard work of honest communication. Michael's corresponding entry was equally penetrating. Michael's pride has become his prison. He would rather suffer in isolation than accept help, would rather fail magnificently than succeed with assistance. This stubborn independence served him well in his younger years, but has become destructive now that circumstances require humility and collaboration. He views needing help as personal failure rather than recognizing that interdependence is the foundation of healthy relationships. The siblings spent several evenings reading the journal aloud to each other, a practice that felt simultaneously invasive and necessary. Jonathan's words forced them to confront truths about themselves that they had avoided examining, revealed patterns of behavior that had contributed to their current circumstances. But it was Jonathan's final entry that proved most transformative. "I am leaving my children the most valuable inheritance I can provide, the opportunity to discover their own strength, resilience, and capacity for growth. Money would have solved their immediate problems, but prevented them from developing the character necessary to handle future challenges. I am betting everything on their ability to become people Margaret would recognize and admire. This may be the greatest act of faith in my life." The realization that their father's decision represented faith rather than punishment shifted something fundamental in both siblings' understanding of recent events. He had not rejected them, but challenged them. He had not given up on them, but created circumstances that would force them to find resources they didn't know they possessed. The practical implications of this understanding were immediate and overwhelming. Without their father's financial safety net, they needed to solve their own problems through their own efforts. Emily's divorce proceedings, which had stalled while she waited for external rescue, required her active participation and difficult decisions. Michael's job search, which had become increasingly desperate and unfocused, needed to be approached with realistic expectations and strategic planning. For the first time since returning to the greenhouse, they began working together rather than simply coexisting in shared misery. Emily researched resources for entrepreneurs rebuilding after business failure. Michael swallowed his pride enough to accept temporary work that was beneath his previous position, but provided immediate income and restored some sense of purpose. The house itself became a project that required cooperation. Without Jonathan's meticulous maintenance, various systems needed attention that neither sibling possessed the skills to address alone. They learned to troubleshoot heating problems together, to coordinate repairs that their limited budget required them to attempt themselves, to divide responsibilities in ways that played to each person's strengths. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the greenhouse began to feel like a home again, rather than a museum to their father's memory. Not because his absence became less painful, but because his presence was being honored through the gradual transformation of his children into people worthy of the love they had taken for granted for so many years. Spring arrived in Willow Creek with the persistence of hope, pushing through the last stubborn patches of snow to reveal the green shoots that had been waiting beneath winter's weight. Emily stood in what had once been Margaret's garden, surveying the wild tangle of overgrown roses and volunteer trees that had claimed the space during years of neglect. The sight should have been discouraging, but instead she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that broken things could be restored with patience and effort. Michael found her there on a Saturday morning in late March, his hands dirty from working on the house's temperamental plumbing. They had spent the past month learning to be siblings again, sharing the burden of maintaining a house that required more attention than either of them had realized when their father handled such matters invisibly. The work was humbling but somehow healing, each small repair a step toward reclaiming ownership of their lives. "Remember when Dad tried to teach us about gardening?" Emily asked, pulling at a stubborn weed that had wrapped itself around a rose bush. "How we complained about getting dirty and just wanted to go inside and watch television?" Michael nodded, settling beside her on the small bench that Jonathan had built for Margaret decades earlier. The wood was weathered but still solid, another testament to their father's careful craftsmanship. "I keep thinking about all the things he tried to teach us that we weren't interested in learning. How to change oil, how to balance a checkbook properly, how to fix things instead of replacing them." They worked together in companionable silence, clearing space around plants that had survived years of neglect through stubborn resilience. The physical labor was meditative, requiring enough attention to quiet the anxious thoughts that had dominated their minds for months. Emily found herself remembering Margaret's voice explaining the difference between annual and perennial flowers, between plants that needed full sun and those that thrived in shade. "Emily called," Michael said eventually, referring to their father's journal rather than his sister. They had adopted this shorthand to distinguish between Emily the person and Emily as she appeared in Jonathan's careful observations. "She said something yesterday that I can't stop thinking about." Emily paused in her weeding, sensing the weight of whatever Michael was preparing to share. Their conversations had become more honest since reading their father's journal, but certain topics remained difficult to approach directly. She said that the hardest part of growing up wasn't learning to take care of herself, but learning to let other people take care of her when she needed it. That independence and interdependence weren't opposites, but different sides of the same maturity. The observation was characteristically perceptive, revealing Emily's struggle with accepting help while offering it freely to others. Michael had noticed this pattern in his sister's behavior. Her willingness to listen to his problems while deflecting attention from her own, her tendency to minimize her needs while amplifying her support for others. "I've been thinking about what Dad wrote about me," Emily said, settling back on the bench with soil-stained hands. "About avoiding difficult conversations, about choosing peace over honesty. He was right about my marriage, about how I let problems fester rather than addressing them directly. She had begun meeting with a counselor, using some of their limited resources to address patterns of behavior that had contributed to multiple relationship failures. The process was uncomfortable and often painful, but it provided tools for understanding why she consistently chose silence over conflict, even when conflict might have prevented larger problems. "The divorce papers came through last week," she continued. "Final this time, and instead of feeling devastated, I felt relieved. Like I was finally admitting something I'd known for years, but couldn't say out loud." Michael studied his sister's profile, noting the subtle changes in her posture and expression that suggested a growing comfort with difficult truths. She looked tired but not defeated, sad but not hopeless. The woman who had returned to the greenhouse in crisis was gradually being replaced by someone stronger and more realistic about her own capabilities and limitations. "I got a job offer," Michael said suddenly, the words emerging before he could reconsider their timing. "Nothing glamorous, but steady. Managing operations for a small manufacturing company about an hour north. It would mean commuting, but the salary is decent and there's room for advancement." Emily turned to face him fully, recognizing the significance of this development. Michael had been working temporary positions for months, swallowing his pride to accept work that was beneath his previous status, but provided essential income and restored some sense of purpose. This offer represented something different. Not just employment, but the possibility of rebuilding a career on realistic foundations. "That's wonderful," she said, meaning it completely. "When do you start?" "That's the thing," Michael replied, his voice carrying uncertainty that had become familiar during their months of shared crisis. "I'm not sure I want to take it. Not yet, anyway. I keep thinking about this house, about finishing the work Dad started, about making sure everything is stable before I move on to the next phase." Emily understood the hesitation without needing explanation. The greenhouse had become more than shelter during their months of healing. It had become a laboratory where they were learning to be functional adults, responsible for their own welfare and accountable to each other in ways their previous independence had never required. "The house isn't going anywhere," Emily said gently. "And neither am I, at least not anytime soon. Whatever work needs finishing, we can figure it out together." "But Michael, you can't put your life on hold indefinitely because you're afraid of repeating old mistakes." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ben Kozlowski, carrying a paper bag that smelled distinctly of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls. His visits had become a weekly tradition, a way of maintaining connection to Jonathan's memory while offering practical support to his surviving family. "Thought you might be hungry," Ben said, settling onto the grass beside the bench with the easy familiarity of someone who had become family through shared loss. Working in the garden is hungry work. They shared the bread, while Ben recounted stories from the bakery, updates on customers who had known Jonathan and continued to ask about his children. The community's interest in their welfare felt both comforting and obligating, a reminder that their father's reputation created expectations they were still learning to meet. "You know," Ben said eventually, "your father talked a lot about this garden in his final weeks. How Margaret had designed it to bloom in sequence, so there would always be something flowering from early spring through late fall. He said she planned it like a symphony, with different movements and themes that built on each other." Emily looked around the overgrown space with new appreciation, beginning to see past the current chaos to the underlying structure that Margaret had created. Hidden beneath years of neglect, the bones of a carefully planned garden remained, waiting for someone with patience and knowledge to restore its intended beauty. "Maybe that's what we're doing," she said thoughtfully. "Not starting over, but uncovering what was always there, clearing away what doesn't belong so the original design can emerge." Michael nodded, understanding that she was talking about more than gardening. Their family's foundation, damaged by crisis and poor choices, was still solid enough to support rebuilding. Their father's love, tested by disappointment and rejection, had endured even death. Their mother's values, obscured by years of taking them for granted, remained available as guides for future decisions. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden, the three of them continued working together, clearing space for growth that would come with time and care. The pocket watch in Emily's purse remained stopped at 6:47, but time itself had resumed its forward motion, carrying them toward a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Jonathan and Margaret Harris Memorial Pavilion took place on a crisp October morning, 8 months after Jonathan's death and nearly a year after his exile from the greenhouse. Emily and Michael stood among a crowd of Willow Creek residents gathered on the grounds of the senior home, watching as their father's financial legacy was transformed into something tangible and lasting. The new wing rose from the landscaped grounds like a promise fulfilled, its warm brick facade and generous windows designed to maximize natural light and create spaces where elderly residents could live with dignity and comfort. A brass plaque beside the main entrance bore their parents' names and the inscription Jonathan had specified, "For those who understand that love is measured not in years, but in moments of grace freely given." Michael had taken the manufacturing job 3 months earlier, but his daily commute had become an opportunity for reflection rather than merely transportation. The work was challenging enough to be satisfying without being overwhelming, and his colleagues respected his experience while accepting his need to rebuild his professional reputation gradually. More importantly, the steady income had allowed him to contribute meaningfully to the greenhouse's maintenance and to support Emily's efforts to restart her business. Emily had reopened her salon in a smaller space downtown, accepting that her dreams of expansion had been premature and unrealistic. The new shop was intimate and manageable, with 2 chairs and a philosophy focused on quality over quantity. Her client base was growing slowly but steadily, built on relationships rather than aggressive marketing, on word-of-mouth recommendations earned through careful attention to individual needs. But it was their relationship with each other that had undergone the most profound transformation. The siblings who had once competed for their parents' approval and later blamed each other for their shared failures had learned to function as genuine partners. They shared the greenhouse comfortably, dividing responsibilities according to preference and ability rather than rigid equality. More importantly, they had learned to have difficult conversations with kindness, to support each other through setbacks without enabling destructive behavior. "Dad would be proud of this," Emily said, watching elderly residents explore their new accommodations with obvious pleasure. Several used walkers or wheelchairs, moving slowly but independently through spaces designed to accommodate their needs. Others clustered in the common areas, already forming the social connections that would transform a building into a community. Michael nodded, noting the way natural light filled the corridors and how the design encouraged interaction while respecting privacy. Jonathan's money had been converted into something that would serve people for decades, providing not just shelter but dignity for residents who might otherwise have faced their final years in less comfortable circumstances. After the crowd dispersed, Emily and Michael found themselves alone in Margaret's restored garden, which had become their shared project over the months since spring. Working together on evenings and weekends, they had cleared the overgrowth, replanted according to Margaret's original design, and created a space that honored both their mother's vision and their father's memory. Emily settled onto the bench Jonathan had built, pulling the pocket watch from her purse with the ritual care that had marked her handling of it since his death. The timepiece had remained frozen at 6:47 for 8 months, its stopped hands a constant reminder of the moment when their opportunity for redemption might have ended forever. But on this particular afternoon, surrounded by the evidence of their growth and healing, Emily felt compelled to wind the watch one more time. She turned the small crown with gentle pressure, listening for the mechanical heartbeat that had been silent since her father's death. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, the second hand began to move. The watch resumed its measured progression through time, as if awakening from a sleep that had lasted exactly as long as necessary for healing to take root. Michael stared at the moving hands with an expression of wonder that had nothing to do with belief in magic and everything to do with recognition of symbolism. Time had indeed resumed its forward movement in their lives. They were no longer frozen in the moment of their father's disappointment, no longer trapped by the consequences of choices they couldn't undo. "Look at that," Emily whispered, holding the watch so both could see its face clearly. The hands showed 3:15, the actual time of day, as if the watch had somehow calculated the hours that had passed since their father's death and resumed its purpose precisely when purpose was restored to their lives. They returned to the greenhouse that evening to find Margaret's metal box sitting on the kitchen table, exactly where Emily had left it months earlier after reading Jonathan's journal. The small iron key lay beside it, worn smooth by decades of handling. Hidden beneath the familiar items was an envelope neither sibling had noticed before, addressed in their father's careful script, "For my children, when they are ready to understand." Inside, written on paper that bore Margaret's favorite stationery, was a letter that completed the lesson Jonathan had begun with his financial bequest. "If you are reading this, you have learned what I hoped you would learn. That love is not a transaction, that family is not about convenience, and that the most valuable things in life cannot be purchased or inherited." Without discussion, Emily opened the box one final time, revealing the treasured mementos that had survived their parents' lifetimes. But something was different. You have discovered your own strength, developed your own resources, and chosen to work together rather than blame each other for circumstances beyond your control. The money I gave away was never meant to punish you, but to free you from the assumption that happiness could be purchased with financial security. Your mother and I provided too much for too long, protecting you from consequences that might have taught you resilience earlier. This was our failure as parents, and my final attempt to correct it. You are now the people we always hoped you would become, independent but not isolated, strong but not cruel, wise enough to value what matters and brave enough to choose love even when love is difficult. The house is yours not because you inherited it, but because you have earned the right to call it home. Keep the windows open. Closed hearts, like closed houses, grow stale and cold. Love requires fresh air, honest conversation, and the courage to remain vulnerable even after being hurt. Your mother would be proud of who you have become. I am proud of who you have become. Remember us not as perfect parents, but as people who loved you completely and trusted you enough to let you find your own way to happiness. The treasure was never in the box. It was in the key that opened your hearts to each other again. Emily and Michael sat in the kitchen they had shared as children, reading their father's final words as the autumn sun set beyond the windows their mother had chosen for their view of the garden she loved. The pocket watch ticked steadily on the table between them, marking time that moved forward now instead of standing still, measuring moments that accumulated into a future built on foundations their parents had laid with patient love. Outside, the first stars appeared in the October sky, shining down on a greenhouse where broken things had been mended, lost time had been recovered, and a family had learned that love was indeed the only inheritance that truly mattered.